Live on DukeBox Radio, the Jack Chong Show.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Well, this will be my last show on DukeBox before I head off to have my IB exams. This headphone is a bit hard to sort out. Now, for whoever's out there who are interested in running this show or anything similar in this fashion, drop an email to dukebox@wellingtoncollege.org.uk and tell us your ideas. Now, today we have a long-awaited debate about gender equality or gender bracket inequality. We have two distinguished guests coming today. Would you like to introduce yourself first?
I'm Tamara, Christodoulou, and I'm a part-time physics teacher here.
And I'm Denise Brown, and I'm an English teacher and the head of WCPCI.
Okay, sure. Let's get started. I mean, the listeners can't wait. So, what is your definition of gender equality?
Me first?
Yeah, sure.
So I would say that where we're living now, gender equality, a lot of people sometimes conflate equality of outcome, equality of opportunity. I think we agree that equality of outcome probably shouldn't be the definition of gender equality, and I would tend to agree with that. I would go with equality of opportunity, and to that I would add that equality of opportunity should be something enshrined in the country's laws, so kind of a baseline of protection for men and women against discrimination for them for them being male or female. I would only further add that because I would argue that I think the laws in this country are really pretty good, relative to the rest of the world, and I think equality of opportunity in legal terms is pretty available. I would add a kind of nuanced grey area and say that perhaps a more refined definition could be fairness, because things can be completely legal but be quite unfair towards men and women. And I think there are a lot of grey areas that we can talk about where men and women encounter situations which are quite unfair to them on the grounds of their gender.
And you, Ms. Brown?
I'd agree with what Tamara has said. I think that equality of opportunity is the baseline at which we're aiming. I think the only thing I'd add is to say that equality of opportunity is a nice soundbite, but it's a complex thing in real life. It's when you're talking about whose opportunity are you looking at and what base are they starting from, and where we're dealing with gender, we're dealing with systems and structures that are going back generations and even centuries actually, and they need to be examined in a way. I suppose you could draw the analogy, it's not precise, but it's in the same ballpark as systems and structures around race and class. So equality of opportunity is good.
Sure.
Yeah.
Ms. Christodoulou, you mentioned something about legal but unfair. Do you have any examples of that?
Good. I'm sure there are very many. I mean, you could argue that there is some systematic unfairness against women in reaching, senior positions in corporations. There's nothing specifically legal about that, unless, of course, somebody is genuinely discriminating based on sex, which they may or may not be. But let's assume that they're not. Let's assume, that they are promoting people based on personality traits, and they find that a woman's personality traits might not be to their liking. Technically, that's not illegal. You could argue it's unfair. There are many examples of that.
And would you say it's unfair?
I think it really depends. I think we would have to look at the specifics of the situation. It can be, certainly. There is a lot of unfairness out there. I'm certainly not sitting here arguing the point that things are perfect and, whatever is happening to people is fair. This country is perfect. Far from. It absolutely can be unfair. I would also add that sometimes it actually is fair enough and kind of part of the reality of the world. And, people do get promoted sometimes based on personal preferences, and that can advantage or disadvantage men and women. So it's very situation specific.
Do you have any thoughts of that?
Just to add to that, talking about things where things are legal, or the legal system or the structures. I mean, we could give a good example of, for instance, a legal structure like VAT, which aims to be fair. People only experience VAT at point of purchase. The tampon tax, it's called in popular press. That's certainly legal. Tampons and sanitary products are defined as luxury goods and therefore subject to VAT. However, that means every woman who will probably end up spending about £500 for something she has to buy every month for about 40 years of her life. And that is an example of a systemic inequity that is certainly legal. And in fact, it's something that probably the majority of legislators don't even think about, because it's not something they have to spend money on. So there's an example of the difference between fairness and legality.
That is a very good start. Now, shall we move on to another modern example of how gender inequality reveals itself, and how perhaps we can get to gender equality, the gender pay gap. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think to address equality, first of all, I think the whole concept of equality is a constantly receding horizon, and it's always relative to where we are now. So things that would have been considered perfectly egalitarian, even 10 years ago, or certainly 100 years ago, have changed a lot. I mean, we've only had, women have only had the vote since 1918, but actually for people who were alive in the 1920s, that would have seemed like that was a goal. But obviously, looking back there, it was a milestone that was just the beginning of something. So in terms of, I think, defining equality around one issue like the gender pay gap, it's certainly an issue. It's a salient issue. It does actually narrow it quite a lot. I think in gender pay gap is probably something that's going to resolve as more women come into positions where they're earning more money. It's not specific. I mean, we have laws against discriminating against doing in terms of pay if a male and a female do the same job. That is actually illegal. So the law supports pay equality. I suppose maybe more of a question is, given that the law came in supporting pay equality was passed in 1971, why we still have, on average, an 18% gender pay gap in this country overall. That needs more attention to actual working practices on the ground.
What's your thought, Ms. Christodoulou?
How do we reach gender equality?
Or on gender pay gap, just
gender pay gap
specifically.
Sure. So I would argue that the gender pay gap is quite a complex thing, certainly, and I would stress that there are very many factors, dozens, that contribute to it. My view is that my initial kind of aversion to the discussions that have often been prevalent is that the gender pay gap, I think, has been a little bit overly politicized by many people to try and appeal to the female vote. I think there are some world leaders who would kind of highlight the pay gap and go, look at this is terrible, we have inequality, vote for me, I'll sort it out. And it's overly simplistic, it's infantilizing towards women, and it really doesn't go into anywhere near deep enough analysis. And I think if you do the analysis, you'll find a range of reasons. Some of them, in my opinion, absolutely need to be fixed. I don't think they account for a huge amount of the pay gap. So there absolutely is, some sexism, discrimination, genuine unfairness, illegal even, to go back to fairness versus illegality, that
Sure.
That men are taking, not men, just companies, men and women, may well be taking advantage of. Those absolutely need to be fixed. Everybody, I think, would agree. There are some that I would argue should be fixed because they are down to perhaps women's own behaviors or their own kind of self-imposed restrictions. Things like women are less likely to ask for promotions, women are less confident in applying for jobs in the first place. I don't see that as anything malicious or anyone's fault, and I think women themselves can do a lot to help themselves. Some external help as well, for sure. but I think the starting point should always be with the person themselves wanting to change it. But also a lot of it is things that I would argue don't need to be changed. And I suspect we'll probably talk more about that, which is to do with just personal preferences and what choices men and women make in terms of the careers they go into, what choices men and women make in terms of how much leave they take, parental leave being the obvious one, whether they come back full-time or part-time, how much overtime they work, and so forth. I suspect that this issue of parental leave is a really huge one, especially if you take the gender pay gap up until the age of about 30 and you normalize for all these factors, it actually works slightly in favor of women. Totally within standard deviation, suggesting a tiny bit of positive discrimination, I would say fairly irrelevant. And it really widens after the age of 30, I think even 35. That's where it really comes to bear. So I think that's a really, really big contributor to the pay gap. In my personal opinion, it's one that that shouldn't be one that we jump on and propose to fix.
Ms. Brown?
I entirely agree about personal responsibility and personal choices. Having said that, I think that it's very easy to give an erroneous impression that personal choices are made in a social vacuum. And I'm sure we might touch on later the idea of essentialism and the sort of psychological differences between males and females, and that those arguments they sort of go near implying that there is some innate essential quality and people make choices, and also without socializing, without the influence of society, that studies show the exact same behaviors in men and women are either rewarded or penalized. So choices around staying at home to care for children are driven, of course they're individual choices, but they're also driven by social expectations and as well as personal circumstances. I think, and also going back to the idea of the law, it's as long as we have disparity of pay and to a certain extent disparity of opportunity for males and females, then it's always going to make plain practical sense for if you have to pay your mortgage, the person who earns more money is the one who's most likely to choose to stay at work of a couple. And at the moment, that tends to be the male partner of a heterosexual partnership. So the two parents would be, sacrificing their living standards and possibly their children's living standards to the ideology of equality if they're going to say, well, I'm going to go back to work even though you earn 3 times as much as me. I mean, that's just common sense, that the person who earns more is probably going to be the one who doesn't take so much time off because people, as I said, have to pay their mortgages. And I guess parental leave is one of those things that is something that the law has to work looking at how people's personal choices are affected by those social expectations as well. And as long as parental leave and the way as long as parental leave rules don't apply equally to both partners, then it's always going to be the woman who is entitled to more generous parental leave. I say generous in the loosest possible way, than her male partner. So the doubling up there of the fact that the male partner probably earns more to start with, but also he's not entitled to the same parental leave entitlements, it's sort of doubly pushing them for the woman to make the decision to stay at home or go part-time. So we need to look at society. I know Jess Phillips, the MP, she has a very sort of soundbitey response to this. She said, well, the best way to to solve the problem of the gender pay gap is to make parental leave rules absolutely the same for men and women, because kids do have 2 parents.
Ms. Christodoulou, do you have any ideas? Do you have any thoughts about what Ms. Brown has said, particularly on how social expectations affect perhaps the relationship between a wife and a husband?
I do. Could I just add to what Ms.
course.
Brown or Denise? What am I supposed to say, Denise?
Yeah, sure.
Denise said, because I agree. I mean, everything she said is absolutely true. The point I would add, because this is a gender equality debate, everything she's touched on is really, I think, really suggests that actually it's a kind of restrictive. I mean, parental leave, because you have a child, is a wonderful thing. That's why we all do it. Of
course.
Obviously. And but it does obviously add a dimension into life that actually ends up being restrictive to both men and women.
Yeah.
And what you said is absolutely true. So women will tend to be the ones to take maternity leave, and you could argue, be lucky enough or be the ones compelled to stay at home.
Mm-hmm.
I would say absolutely the same about husbands. Being the higher earner, ironically, is a bit of a ball and chain.
Absolutely.
Because husbands are the ones compelled to go to work. Now, whether or not they have a preference for doing that is another matter entirely, but they really have very little choice in the matter. And sometimes, Denise has never said this at all, but I have had a lot of women talk about how, we have to stay at home and my husband gets to go to work. And I would really change the narrative, the vocabulary, the mindset. It's like there's no getting to go to work. I mean, work is difficult and stressful and highly pressurized.
Especially when you're the only breadwinner.
Absolutely, all the more so because there's no extra income. There's an extra mouth to feed. So I think I know that we agreed on this in the pre-show chat that there's a lot to be done actually for men. Ironically,
well, I think
really hasn't been done yet.
I think gender, the whole thing of gender expectations and societal expectations around gender are a straitjacket for both males and females. And I'm actually saying males and females rather than men and women, because actually people are gendered. The very first thing that is that defines you when you are born is, oh, it's a boy, or oh, it's a girl. Your gender is put on you immediately before you have any say in the matter. And obviously, yes, your sex is biological, and that's not in dispute, but your gender is something that society puts on you. From the moment you come out of your mother's womb, you are treated in a particular way, given that you're, depending on what your genitals look like. So I think that's a really important thing. So males and females are equally straitjacketed. To go back to Tamara's point about men having to go to work, the pressures that are imposed on men by gender expectations and the lack of gender equality in that sort of perhaps traditionally limits women to sort of staying at home in the kitchen looking after the children, whatever, is they're massive, and they actually mean that men are compelled. Men don't have a choice to sort of think, oh well, I'll play around at work for a few years and then I'll get married to someone and then I might take some time off and play with my kids. I mean, men don't have that choice usually. Men are sort of expected.
I literally did that.
Yeah, me too. A bit long ago. But then I got to sort of an age where I thought, actually, I have a brain and I have a university degree. I'd quite like to use it. And then I was lucky enough to have the choice. But my husband didn't have that choice because and so I think that it's a very straitjacketing thing, and I think one of the really worrying things about gender inequalities and why it's such an urgent subject is not so much that there's a gender pay gap. It's actually the fact that women got the vote in 1918, women over 30. All women have had the vote since 1928 in this country. And women, when you think of how far women have come since 1928, the options that are now available to women compared to, like my grandmother, your great grandmother, that's extraordinary progress in 100 years. And technological and medical progress has freed women. The pill, the Gender Pay Act, which is sort of gradually coming through. All those things, the fact that, there are now, women airline pilots, women, everything. And men, actually, if you look at a man in 2019 and a man in 1919,
same.
I mean, there's a bit more technology available to them, but actually the options available to them in terms of defining their lives haven't really changed very much. And I think there's a real problem with how boys are going to make their way in the world when they're straitjacketed by these gender expectations that expect them to be strong and silent and always be the breadwinner and always sort of be in charge and not, be too emotional or anything like that. I think women are a lot freer, and we see that in suicide rates, for instance. 80% of suicides in this country are males, and they're young males between 18 and 45, and that's a real crisis. And it's a crisis for men, and it's about gender.
And women. The women in their lives.
Obviously the women in their lives, but it's the men who are dying.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I think, I mean, we've perhaps gone a bit sort of off topic there, but I think that whole thing about gender equality, it absolutely agree with Tamara that it's something that is, it's not males against females or females against males. It's actually something that's about human equality, human dignity, human choices, and human freedom.
Great. I'd love to continue this conversation, particularly on how, Miss Brown, you mentioned, you touched upon masculinity and femininity within the social expectations and the social structure. But now we'll have a break and enjoy the song Girls Just Wanna Have Fun. What a good song.
Yay!
So let's get started. Masculinity and femininity and the within the social structure, and how how men and women are expected to behave as male and female. Is that a good way to put it?
I think it's a fairly clear. I think that is the way it is put.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, okay. So what are your thoughts? I mean, because Ms. Brown, you talked about how it is equally important for men and women to identify how social expectations impose obligations on them. So, and I mean, this is personally interesting for me because I grew up in a Chinese culture within that which emphasizes a lot on family values and of course men being the breadwinner, women being the housewives, taking care of the kids, etc. And I mean, in my personal kind of social circle, I do encounter some men, some boys who are in my age, some teenagers who are struggling to cope with that identity, to bear that obligation.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts?
Can I just digress slightly to
Yes,
talk about
yes.
the way we... Tamara, I think you mentioned earlier something about the media presentations of things, or the way the extremes that we tend to see it as an either or, or a sort of, you know, it's either men or
Like the
women.
men
or,
hater
men
and
haters,
the
misogynists.
misogynist.
That's a good, the two extremes. And I think there's a lot of media discourse around the extremes on either side that actually ignores and kind of, well, completely overlooks the real life experience of the majority of people, and also and tends towards a sort of essentialist discourse around men are like this, women are like this, you know, and usually fairly insulting sort of generalizations about either men or women. And I think coming back to socialization, that idea that I think, you know, human behaviour is fairly standard. There's a sort of spectrum of people. You say you know some boys who struggle with those expectations. Equally, you know some boys who don't. And you probably know, if you ask them, some girls who struggle with expectations that they might be a bit more girly. And I think some behaviours are probably fairly constant across both sexes, but certain behaviours are reinforced, and I can only give an example in terms of sort of the way that people respond differently to the same behaviours in a male or a female. So, for instance, you know, that the sort of stereotypical one, I suppose, is the little girl is called bossy, whereas the little boy is sort of, oh, he's being a boy, you know, his boys will be boys and bossy boots girls, or an adult woman is strident or shrill or aggressive, whereas a man's being assertive or decisive. And they're actually, if you look at it in the workplace or in families, they're probably the same behaviours, but they're received differently, and that's because of those expectations. So this idea of masculinity and femininity is, in some ways, it's, I don't know if you'd agree. In some ways, obviously, I'm not talking about biological sex so much, but that the sort of gender expectations, gender sort of socially constructed and also built by ourselves. We kind of perform gender. I mean, we all know I need to put on my, you know, I don't know, put on my lipstick and look nice or whatever. That's a sort of really sort of basic and sort of simplistic example. Or, you know, see all the boys going to the gym. Because they want to say something about how they looking manly, masculine, yeah. And that's socially reinforced, isn't it? You get a lot of kudos for being well, I don't know, what do you call it, toned or whatever, or being fit or being strong. So physically and emotionally, there's certain things that are socially pushed on us, and that spectrum, I think, goes across both genders more than we tend to assume. Tomorrow.
And so of course. I would agree with a lot of that. I do have slightly... Oh, no, not even a but, like a slightly different contribution to the view, I could say. I do agree that, you know, this kind of cause and effect can be quite circular.
Yeah.
We do have a kind of positive feedback cycle. There are definitely generalizations. I think we all know that about, masculine traits and feminine traits, how boys, men behave, and women and girls and so forth. They go out into the world and behave that way, then they're perceived to behave that way.
Yep.
And then people kind of comment on them behaving that way, so they continue to behave that way. And it's quite difficult to kind of know where the loop begins and where it ends.
The comment can be either negative or positive, can't it? So it's,
You mean positive feedback or negative?
yeah, it's a positive loop
yeah.
feedback or a negative feedback.
Oh, yeah,
loop,
absolutely.
yeah,
I don't mean
yeah.
positive like necessarily good.
Yeah.
It just,
Yeah.
kind of, it feeds itself. So that's certainly true. The thing I would say about social expectation, again, we can only generalize so much. I think we have to generalize to a certain extent because we can't individualize 60 million people in this country.
Sure.
But we have to limit how much we generalize. So I'm certain that there are people in positions where somehow this positive/negative feedback cycle has adversely affected them and overly conditioned them to a point beyond which is true to them. But I think, again, the best advice that I would give, that I have myself followed, is to always be as true to yourself as you can. The example I'm going to give is actually Denise in the pre-show chat. Do you remember we talked about humor and how differently it's perceived? And I thought that was really interesting because there are these studies that say that men use humor and they're perceived better, and women use humor and they're not perceived as well.
Yeah.
There is a kind of possible explanation to that, and it's one that's almost complementary to women. I think men at work are perceived as quite conscientious, disagreeable, highly focused, and actually not very approachable, to generalize, if I may, for the minute. Women tend to be more personable, more agreeable. So when a man uses humor, it's almost seen as something that humanizes him. So it's seen as a positive thing because he's so unapproachable that when he cracks a joke, it's like, this guy's not so bad. A woman almost doesn't need to do that. She's perceived perhaps not to have to do that. So if she deploys the same humor, it might actually work against her. She might be seen to be trying too hard or to trying to do something, not being too serious, but also not being her true self, if you see what I mean. Now, the reason I pick on humor is because I use humor a lot. I've used it in pretty much every job interview I've ever had, and it served me very, very well. So I realize how this is coming across. I'm such a hoot, and everyone likes me, which is not at all what I mean. But I mean, I've used humor since birth, since I could speak. I don't know why, for whatever reason I did. I'm dry, sarcastic. So it's very true to me, and because I use it in a very honest way, in a way that I'm very practiced with using, I found never to have experienced that bad effect, which I think is lovely. To be fair, I have worked in corporate situations, and it's worked very well for me there as well. So I don't know, is this like a half contentious issue? Barely, but I do think that being true to yourself is the best starting point. I think it's the best defense mechanism we have against what society might expect of us.
When you say being true to yourself, I would like to come back to that idea about boys and men being unable to cope with their emotions. I mean, is that a generalisation, or is that I think that's, well, I'm going to go back to that very distressing suicide statistic, which does suggest that there is some objective issue around males and emotions and being able to process emotions in a healthy way. So my question would be, how do we get to a place where people are able to be true to themselves if they don't know who they are, and if society is not encouraging them to actually explore, get to know themselves, apart from just performing like being the bloke down in the gym, or being that very stern doer, executive, in control and unapproachable. How do people get to be? This may be a rhetorical question. But how do we get to be true to ourselves if society is
telling us what to do?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
That's a fantastic question, and it's deeply philosophical, and I'm sure the jury's still out on every front.
Yeah.
And may I take this opportunity to therefore mention my Jordan Peterson,
Yes, of course.
because I
I was just
I'm a
waiting
fan.
for
Yeah, yeah. Because I'm such a big fan. I'm a big fan. That's irrelevant. I think the reason that he has such a following amongst men, so amongst all people, but
Young
I mean,
men,
he
particularly.
does admit, young
Yeah.
men.
And he gets millions of YouTube
Absolutely.
clicks.
Is I think precisely because to them, from what they can see, he's brought them closer to that answer than anyone has before. Now, I'm not saying his answer is objectively true or correct. He's a man with an opinion, but clearly it resonates. So I can't speak on behalf of men. I'm not one. But I think it's lovely that we're actually talking and considering this, because I know both Denise and I actually care deeply about the issues affecting men, and in some ways I think what we were talking about before, the fact that women have come so far, we've had so much freedom afforded to us to the point where we have this first world problem of decision fatigue. Men have sort of changed very little about their lifestyle, and for that reason I think in some ways they haven't really explored who they really are to the same extent as women. By the very virtue that I can afford to choose, do I want to stay at home, am I kind of mummy mum, am I a career mum, it does force you to think, who am I and what I want out of life and how do I want to spend my time. Men just don't have that time. They just keep going to work, and because they have to keep going to work, they have to keep adjusting to work and the requirements of work and the requirements of the family, and no wonder they're jumping off buildings if they don't get that promotion.
Well, that's assuming that they have got a job.
Oh,
What about all the young men who have been sold this idea that to be a successful person you have to be someone successful in your career? What if you can't get a job? What if you're competing now with women who are in some ways, and certainly as you said, young women up to the age of 30 are outperforming in academically and in the workplace, because women are more, compliant. They've been socialised possibly to be more compliant, more agreeable. Always do their prep and listen and things. And they authority figures like women. Young women, and that they fit in. They're good, compliant workers, and there are a lot of young men out there who are thinking, I'm going to inherit the world here, and my whole identity revolves around making a success of my career. And then, what happens if they aren't able to do that? So I mean, it's just a rhetorical question, but we do have this issue, and I think it's quite tempting for a lot of those young men to feel, it's all because women are taking over the jobs. When actually perhaps the system itself, the society that actually pitches people against each other, is actually something we need to be looking at and examining a little more, and saying, what are the realities, the everyday realities of people's lives, not the extreme MRAs on the one hand, or the sort of turfs on the other hand, but actually the vast majority of ordinary people who are just trying to get on with their lives, and who actually like each other and would like to help each other and live together in a way that is mutually supportive.
Yeah, that's very true. So shall we take a break now and let's continue on feminist politics? And well, we did talk a little bit about psychological traits in male and female, and how they are rewarded or punished differently across that spectrum. Perhaps we can talk about the fringes of different social movements and how maybe social media, online, the online presence of either man haters or misogynists kind of dilutes the real the real just cause of gender equality. Now let's
distracts from it.
Yeah, that's a better word. Now let's listen to the song Time Is Running Out by Moose.
Wednesdays with Jack Chong.
Very rockish song, which I suspect the society will say that's less feminine, more of a masculine song.
That would
Then-
be very gender stereotyping.
Well, yes, and which is why the subject of my sentence is the society suspects.
I chose it.
Yes, that's great. That's great. So let's talk about the future of feminist politics, and particularly how women are underrepresented in political legislature, if there's one.
Yeah.
So what do you think of the long term trend? Is it going to be? Are we going to have more women in parliament?
Well,
for example?
it so happens that I did some looking at the statistics on it.
Okay.
And it's very clear that there are only 3 countries in the world that have female representation at the legislative level of over 50% or more. And I think it's really interesting that Rwanda is the top with 62% female representation.
And Sweden, I think.
But Rwanda is a really interesting case, because obviously, as we all know, they had a terrible genocide 25 years ago, and they literally had to start everything from scratch after the genocide. So when they started from scratch, they put rules in place that said the representation had to be 50-50, and therefore they've gone from being very low to being the best in terms of equal representation in the world. There are 49 countries that have more than 30% women representatives, and more than half of those have achieved that by some form of quota system. And I think our own parliament is a good example of that. So in 1992, the representation was very low. It was 10% women. 1 in 10 of our MPs was a woman in 1992. In 1997, Labour, Tony Blair were trying to get back in, and they said they were going, and they also they wanted to have more females in Parliament. And after that, they adopted all women shortlists in some constituencies, and then the number of women in Parliament leapt, almost doubled. It went from 10% to 18% female MPs, and since then. Actually, they aimed to get more than 100 out of 650 women in Parliament, and they got 100. They ended up actually with 112, of whom 101 were Labour MPs. Okay. So obviously that quota system works, and actually it's since then it's gradually ticked up. So we have just over 30% in Parliament now, females to males. So it's gradually ticked up, and I don't think it's going to go backwards. I think more women are coming through, and I think also as more women get the chance to show what they can do, then their constituents and colleagues see that they're competent, and all the old sort of suspicions about the unknown, they're negated by knowing someone who's a woman who's good at her job, and therefore they stop having old people who have prejudices will die off, and young people who are arguably more open-minded will start making different choices. So I hope the progress is slow, but it's a positive progress to 50-50 representation.
Sure.
I'll start by saying something kind of maybe a little bit negative or cynical, but actually I will sort of work my way back to consensus with Denise, because I think politics is a very good example. I'm not one for quotas. I see them as a version of equality of outcome, and where does the line of quota end and positive discrimination begin? But having said that, politics is an important, I would argue, an exception, because it really does, what people are, who your MP is, and how many people in the House of Commons.
But should it not be a meritocratic system?
I'm about to get to that.
Okay.
So how many people are representing, say, the female voice, is important. To be cynical, you could argue, okay, well, how many people are representing, the disabled voice, or how many people are representing ethnic minority voices? Because you can cut society into a million subsections. You can't necessarily expect a House of Commons to reflect everyone. And I would go back to your point that it's actually a democracy, right? So we do have to kind of draw a line and say, temporarily, we'll draw a line and say there is nothing bureaucratically stopping women from standing for election. There's nothing to stop people from voting them in. I think in the last election, 84% of constituencies had at least one female candidate. So technically speaking, there was nothing stopping 84% of our House of Commons being female. And we do have to kind of say, okay, but it is a democracy, and if people aren't voting for women, that's fair enough. But having said that, I did do some research myself into Sweden, because what I gathered about Sweden is I don't think they have
a zipper system.
What do you mean by
it's
that?
Like they make sure that equal numbers are standing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So they do a sort of quota in effect. I don't think they have a quota for final numbers. That's down to the public to vote. But some individual parties do have quotas. Yeah. And as Denise said, there is some kind of regulation as to having vaguely equal numbers standing. I also looked at a paper briefly because it's quite long, but I looked at the synopsis and it was sort of bullet pointing possible reasons why Sweden does have 50-50 representation. If that's what we want, if that's what we're aiming for, but if they are getting there somewhat organically and democratically, then fine. You know, it is certainly worth looking at. And one really like top bullet point that they mentioned was universal childcare, which I can totally see. Well, because of course it feeds back. It seems to have nothing to do with politics, but it does. But it does. I mean, ultimately, these small grassroots changes, you know, these sort of little help systems for, I wouldn't say women, men and women, families, really do just open up choices to you. Now, if women have amazing childcare in this country, and we don't really, it's very, very restrictively expensive, you know, who knows what we'd do with that? You know, who knows whether more women would go, I'll go into politics, but it probably would make a change over time. I would also argue, you know, I think which Denise might appreciate, is I do think politics actually is quite well suited to women. It is, if I may stereotype, you know, women being more sociable and choosing more people-oriented careers. Politics is that. So I, you know, to kind of, I don't know, play my own devil's advocate, I probably could argue that maybe there should be a rise of women by virtue of the choices that they might be tempted to make. You know, MPs, don't they hold surgeries? I mean, isn't their daily job to literally sit and listen and empathize with people, which is what women are very good at. It's kind of a personality trait. So if we did make some small social changes, I think it is feasible to expect that it would make some difference. I would still hold off. I don't like quotas. Like I said, I don't like positive discrimination. To me, you know, aiming for 50-50 is a little bit arbitrary. But if we did get there democratically, who am I to complain?
I would just, if I could just come back on quotas, I'd say until I think sometime in the mid-30s, there was a quota system, in a de facto quota system in the British Parliament, and it was 100% male because women weren't allowed to stand.
Fair enough. Hence bad.
yeah, exactly. I think 50-50 is because, I mean, only because it sort of reflects the population.
It's a start, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But coming back, I think I totally agree, that idea that women do politics well, and one thing, the UN report on political representation of women shows, and this is where I got those figures about various different countries, is it shows that legislatures that have more women work more effectively because that collaboration, and women are better, and perhaps this is a salient thing for our very sort of divided sort of times, and is women are better at reaching across party boundaries and boundaries of sort of ideology. Men can sometimes maybe get a bit bound up in their ideologies and their abstracts. Women are, well, you know, we got to get stuff done. So who do I need to talk to?
They're more likely
to get
compromise.
this? Yeah, and they'll work out what and in fact the UN has done a study on how effectively governments and legislatures work when there are more women compared to fewer women, and they've found absolutely that they are more effective and more efficient as well, because women collaborate and they work, they reach out.
That's a very interesting fact.
Can I add? I think I would agree. I would also be tempted to distinguish between sort of maybe local politics and kind of, you know, top level national politics, international politics even. My suspicion is, and this is just my suspicion and a bit of anecdotal evidence from seeing, you know, top female leaders or would-be leaders, you know, Hillary Clinton, Theresa May and so on. I think when it comes to kind of collaborative politics and low-level politics and local politics, I absolutely do agree with that. I think when you get to the really upper echelons where the pressure is high and the decisions are much, much worse, I almost think there must be some kind of self-filtering mechanism. And the women who do get there probably aren't typical women,
yes,
I would argue.
They've actually got to the top in a system that doesn't work collaboratively.
Well, no, exactly. And I wouldn't call it a male system. I would call it a system which is, well, highly
rewards masculine personality traits.
You could say that. I would just say by definition international politics is so kind of confrontational. It's so competitive, and yes, you could say therefore masculine traits, masculine traits, but that's not because of men. I think it's because of the nature of what it is to play politics.
I don't know. Look at Donald Trump. I think he's managed to get to the top not
Yeah.
by really being a typical politician. But I
True.
think a lot of people would say he was a typical example of a certain kind of, well, toxic masculinity.
True. But then you could look at Hillary Clinton, who, you know, in my
Well, she
eyes,
failed.
Is, absolutely, she did. Yeah, no, absolutely, she did fail.
Perhaps because she sold out too much.
No, absolutely, and
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, you know, political discussions aside, in terms of personality traits, the women who do get there do tend to be quite disagreeable. You know, Hillary Clinton to me isn't particularly likable.
Well, to be fair, we're looking at Margaret Thatcher, Theresa
Oh, yeah.
May, and Hillary Clinton.
which I think, yeah, exactly. I mean,
I'm sure there are
that's
lots of lovely, warm, collaborative, and kind
MPs.
female politicians
Oh, I'm sure
out
there
there.
are. No, absolutely. That's why I make the distinction. You know, I'm sure there are plenty of MPs whose names I've never heard of who are absolutely lovely and empathetic.
And
I mean,
lots
there's
of
like
lovely men as well.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
sure.
obviously goes without saying. You know, 600 of them. But yeah, I'm making that distinction about
Yep.
collaboration in terms of
Yeah.
on the grounds with your constituency, and then kind of
Standing for
negotiations.
your national interests.
Absolutely. And then kind of negotiating, you know, Brexit and Donald Trump and, you know, whatever else is going on in the world. That's,
Got it.
yeah.
Now, one final last point. I think we have about one to 2 minutes left. Let's talk about the fact that how social media, how internet polarizes the discussion, and as Ms. Brown said, distracts this discussion of gender equality. So, what are your thoughts?
I think it does.
And
I think it magnifies extreme positions. I think we get a lot of there's a lot of clickbaity stuff going on, which attracts controversy, generates controversy,
This will be one of them.
and then well, hopefully, and then it attracts and generates controversy, and then the actual possible quite valuable and interesting and useful human connections that could have been made by examining the points of difference and how we could reach out from different little bunkers, get lost, because everyone, you know, everybody starts screaming and shouting and saying, you know, how can you say that, you Nazi?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, anything that's handed over to the, you know, judges of social media, to the courtroom of social media, you know, 140 characters and instant gratification. You know, you don't expect a discussion to be held on universal childcare and what benefits it would bring. What you do expect is a lot of pitting men against women, you know, gender against gender, throwing accusations, to, you know, victimizing one, ostracizing the other, patronizing the other, and it really just doesn't help. All it does is reinforce bigoted positions that some people, I hope few, hold, but they do also hold disproportional bandwidth. And it's unfortunate because it also, I think it taints reasonable people's perspective. You know, I'm sort of quite averse to, you know, this is what I said, you know, misandrists and man-haters, because I found so many of them online, because you can find anything online, as well as misogynists, of course.
Yes,
You look in the dark corners of the web and you're just like, oh, these despicable women, and I kind of like, I'm overly anti them, but I realize you have to stop.
Yep, got you. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight, and see you next time.
24 hours a day, online and on your mobile. The voice of the Wellington family. This is DukeBox.
The High Court has ruled against legal challenges trying to block the third runway at Heathrow.